Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. How are you getting on? My name is Thomas Smyth. I'm from a company called Wireless Connect in Ireland, and travelling here today to talk about BGP and remote triggered black hole routing and some denial of service detection. So just a little bit about myself. I'm a technical director of Wireless Connect in Ireland, and I've been a Mikrotik trainer since June 2007, so I think I'm the 22nd trainer they had. And I suppose I'm passionate about internet security, and I like to find elegant solutions to tough problems, so I'm a bit pedantic that way. The primary reason why I come to Mums is because of you guys there. I've met a lot of friends over the last 8 years since I started coming, or 9 years actually, nearly. It's been a real honour to meet a lot of you and exchange many very good ideas with you over a pint or two as this has happened. I think this is my 12th presentation in the Mum, and I deliver presentations to other Mikrotik partners around the world where they're organising events for their clients. Just to talk briefly about Wireless Connect, what we do is we offer consultancy services in terms of data center networking and challenging kind of bespoke solutions for customers with challenging problems. And generally we have a broad range of customers, from governments, their institutions and their contractors, to just financial institutions and or just private businesses, with from your small and medium enterprises to large corporations. So I'm here, well, I'm inspired others who actually lead the charge. Like, I've got a good friend, Warden Maya, who's not here unfortunately, but he's often given brilliant presentations over the years, and as a source of inspiration. Often I try to, he's a good bit more organised than me, so his presentations are always better. But also there's other people like Valens Raidi from Indonesia. I think he's been working on it for the last 15 years, and you know, he actually showed me how to do QoS in Mikrotik before I got Mikrotik training. So, and the likes of Jaromir from the Czech Republic again, he's been with Mikrotik since the year dot, and they're a source of great enthusiasm. I've also, at the other previous Mums that we've been here, I've met some guys who've met some serious challenges and used Mikrotik to overcome them. Some of which is advances in Scandinavia. They actually used the system to automatically control Caterpillar bulldozers to clear a minefield in the north of Norway. And, you know, like with active antennas, it was a pretty awesome project. And Mikrotik was a part of that solution. Then there's DHI Telecom, who provide internet, and unfortunately they're not here today, but they provide internet to the harshest environments over in Afghanistan and Iraq. And the guys have you know, put internet where probably no one else had the balls to put it there. So a fair bit of respect for those guys too. And then we've got like US Sugar, who Pat Harris is there somewhere, and he's a great friend of mine, a good guy, and he's the network architect for US Sugar, and he's actually deployed a very, very big Wi-Fi network. I'm not going to tell you how massive, because he's going to be talking about it tomorrow, but it's well worth watching that tomorrow. Steve Disher is another great guy, we've been working with. He's the author of Router OS, by example. And of course I couldn't not mention my good friends in the Brothers Wisp, JJ Boyd and all the guys, Thomas Kernack, Justin and Wilson and Mike Hammett. Like, they're actually building a new internet exchange using Mikrotik equipment and other open source projects to deliver a new internet exchange in Indianapolis. So if you're around that area, certainly hit them up. I'm sure they'd look after you well. Justin Miller, who called me out that I was a one-trick pony, that I was always talking about BGP and security. So I just wanted to say that I've introduced some more slides to this one. But there's a couple of guys. But what's kind of funny is we're on this Skype messaging all the time, and no matter what part of the world, there's always someone up talking, and it's pretty nice. So you've kept me company on some dark nights and low moments, so I appreciate that, guys. So, and Greg, the legend Sowell, who actually taught me BGP as well as Mikrotik. So there was one or two times where I had to do something, I was like, geez, how do I do that? And he was one of those guys that had a fantastic blog on how to do something and made some difficult projects much easier. So, legend, Greg. Anyway, presentation objectives, that's all the hellos out of the way. What we're going to talk about is denial of service detection tools and techniques. And we're going to talk about denial of service mitigation concepts, strategies associated with that. Try to talk about preparation best practices. So like most of you are not prepared. I'm not prepared nearly as much as I'd like to be prepared for denial of service attack. And that's always the way it's going to be. You know, you're always going to try, and it's something that you just have to keep chipping away when, you know, things are a bit quiet in the office, if they ever are quiet in the office. But it is well worth doing, and it's also just worth preparing and imagining what you would do in such a scenario, kind of like the way I suppose the US military do war games, is to actually have some sort of readiness in the event of a denial of service attack. So the reason why I like this topic is it is on my usual security theme, but it's also a very big, expansive topic. It's a big challenge for all ISPs. Personally, I don't think there's anything more of a threat to our network than a denial of service attack. And also, I do believe strongly in the right to free expression, and I think ISPs have a duty to allow that freedom of communication. And I just don't think it's cool that some people who don't like what you have to say or what you have to do would take your right away to communicate with the other people. And basically, I just want to keep on rocking in the free world. Sorry about that, but I just wanted to say that. So just to say, our corporate environment policy is we like to recycle, so about 30% of the slides are recycled from previous presentations that I've delivered to this fine continent of yours. But I will say that 70% of the slides are new, so it should be okay. It should satisfy some of the guys there. But just to talk about under the bonnet of, for those of you who aren't familiar with BGP, what is BGP? Well, BGP is what ISPs use when they're talking to each other, how to describe what networks are reachable from their individual network. And it's how the whole internet has organically, effectively grown, or uncontrollably organically grown over the past few years. And basically what a BGP session does is between, let's say, you can see there router 1 and router 2 of the slides. Effectively, peer A says the entire internet is available through me, and he sends that message to router 2. And router 2 just simply advertises, well, I have this small network, 5.134.88.0/21. That's reachable via me. And so those guys exchange that routing information, and suddenly now the internet has added, that peer B has effectively added a single network to the entire internet through peer A. So that's basically it. It works by basically starting off as a full exchange between the peers initially, and then incremental updates thereafter. And those incremental updates can last for as long as your BGP session is up, which could be days, months, weeks, years. The longer the better, obviously. So effectively, BGP at the core of it is a scalable, reliable signaling protocol. And it actually does a lot more than just exchange routes. It actually gives information about routes. For instance, if you're signed up with the likes of a provider like Cogent, they will actually indicate when they're advertising routes to you, the country of origin of the routes. So you can actually get an idea of which countries are advertising which networks to you. So this is actually an incredibly powerful feature. And in fact, it's that very feature that you will use to control a response to a denial of service attack, where you actually effectively tell people, okay, I have this route and it has this particular problem. And your ISP will actually learn that route with your community that you set. Sorry about that. So, that basically will allow you to actually communicate without ever talk with your ISP, without ever actually talking to them, talking to their help desk, and asking them to treat it differently. So it is a very powerful feature. Just to talk about our ISP infrastructure ourselves, we have run a small ISP in around 1,000 clients in Ireland. And effectively, we use Mikrotik as our core routing platform across right out to the edge. And effectively, Mikrotik can do it well. We use it generally. So we have two kind of core routers. They're running x86 BGP routers, running router OS, and we effectively take our feeds externally through those two routers. And then those two routers also serve as route reflectors to our various different BGP clients internally on our network. So I'm just going to move swiftly on. So basically, the denial of service attacks that people, what are denial of service attacks? Well, denial of service attacks are effectively maliciously designed attacks that would actually consume resources of various different types. For instance, CPU, bandwidth, or disk I/O, for example. The one we're going to focus on today is clearly, obviously, bandwidth and our CPU, but basically bandwidth of your routers is generally the one that's a premium, and generally that's the one that they could actually attack the easiest. The attacker's objective is pretty much simple: consume all the resources on your network so that you can't serve your clients. Simple as that. They could actually potentially destroy your business. It's a serious problem. So the attack size. The bigger the attack size, the larger the displacement of the real traffic or the legitimate traffic on your network. And that's a key point. So if I was to use this fine analogy on my next slide. So you have a beer going into the glass and it's about to be consumed as it should be. And that's, let's say, the normal operation of your network. Now, then some guy decides to rain on your parade quite heavily and he decides to hit your pint glass with a water cannon. Well, effectively, all the beer will be washed out of the glass and you'll be left with a glass of water and probably knocked on your ass as well. But that effectively is as graphic an example as I could give you as what a denial of service attack does to your network. So, the parties involved in the denial of service, well, you got your perpetrators, kind of, I suppose, dickheads, really. Then you've got facilitators, who are the guys who don't know any better. And there's two types of them. There's the accidental ones, which are through configuration errors or innocent third parties, effectively, or by intentional ones. So you've got these third parties whose computers got compromised, and effectively the perpetrator has prepped them so that they can amplify or cause more damage to your network by relaying the attack through them. So, and then obviously you've got your transit service providers, so they can be a help or a hindrance. It's up to them and you, and how you relate, how you actually talk with your transit providers will determine whether or not they'll be actually a help to you or in fact a hindrance. So it's all about how you can manage it. And then there's the victim, which I hope will never be any of you guys there in the audience. So the types of denial of service attacks that you generally have to deal with, would you have your single source denial of service attack. Stellaris would be an example of one where it's pretty easy to kind of identify the victim and also the source of the attack. But then you got distributed denial of service attack, and then another nuance of the distributed denial of service attack is called reflected amplification attacks. And these ones are quite deadly, like I said, they're extremely powerful, and it's very difficult. It's actually impossible to identify the source of the attack. They're difficult to mitigate and they're generally catastrophic. And the reason for it, and I'll go through what it is in detail, why reflected amplification. I'm going to explain to you how it works and show you why it can be so potent. So the traffic sources are generally infected or compromised machines that become zombies effectively in a botnet. Is usually how it happens. And they pose the biggest problem, like on the internet. You can have 500,000 compromised machines with a 0.5 meg bandwidth. That's a serious amount of firepower that if it was directed against your network. So these are things that you need to be very careful of. Then you've got the denial of service using CPEs or computers that are misconfigured or servers that are misconfigured. And I've seen many examples of this in Ireland. I'm sure you have on your own network where you couldn't understand why you were using so much of your upload. And the reason for it is that potentially that you had left DNS service listing on your external interface, and effectively clients started sending requests in. Now I'm going to go into more detail on that. So the key thing there, I suppose, is, and Mikrotik CPEs are no exception. So if you have DNS or NTP or SNMP running on those systems, they are susceptible to this attack. So what services are most at risk? Well, attackers love using DNS, NTP, and SNMP for reflection attacks. And the reason for it is UDP can't verify the source. So if, for instance, Greg there was annoying me and I wanted to attack him, so what I would do is I'd spoof his IP address and I'd send a message to all these open DNS resolvers saying, can you please give me the list of the root servers on the internet, for example, okay? So I would send out that to a load of DNS resolvers, and effectively they'd all dutifully respond to Greg's IP with trash that he never ever asked for in the first place. And the reason, so that's why it's UDP we use, and also the amplification factor. I only have to send a really small message and I get quite a large response. That's where the amplification factor comes in. So whatever attack capabilities of the bandwidth that the attacker can generate, I can actually amplify it using other people's bandwidth. And it's basically, the amplification factor is basically the request size in bytes divided by the response size in bytes. So it's very straightforward. So here's an example of amplification factors that are typical. This is from the US CERT. So any Tea Party members here, this is an example where big government works. But I'm not going to say any more than that. Might be the wrong part of the country to be saying things like that. But basically, you can see here that with a DNS request, I could amplify my request by 28 to 54 times, depending on the type of request I send through. So if I was just to give you an example, and this is an illustration of how it works. So I've got a compromised host here, and it's basically, I've been hacked, and I basically have 500 megs of internet access. So what I do is I get a list of open DNS resolvers, and I start to send loads of spurious requests with poor old Greg's IP address on it. And what happens is then all these lovely open DNS resolvers give Greg a load of information that he never wanted, and effectively it goes from 500 megs times 54 to 27 gigabits per second. So effectively, with 500 megs of bandwidth, I've actually been able to create a world of trouble for a lot of people en route to poor old Greg's computer. So it's pretty nasty and it's pretty effective. So how do you protect your network from that? Well, you have to do your best and you hope it'll overcome your adversary. And you have to plan for the eventuality and just work out what you can and can't do on the day. There's no point doing stuff that's useless on the day, so it's just to work out what you can and can't do. And prepare your network, so you need to have your firewall rules in place and your routing policies set up to do this, okay? Quality of service limits are quite important as well, and my good friend Greg will be giving a talk about quality of service at BGP later on, so I'm going to leave that off to him. Come on, thanks Greg. So basically, you build denial of service signaling infrastructure. That's a very important one. And this will allow you to kill attacks within your network, but also to advertise issues beyond your network to your transit providers. So how do you defend against attack? Keep calm, don't lose the head. You work through it and you'll be back soon. So you have to plan your response. So there's a couple of things you need to work out. One, how helpful will your ISP be in the event of an attack? This is very important because, and I'll explain to you in a while in a few minutes, but these guys are going to be an integral part of actually stopping the traffic reaching your network before it becomes a problem. That's the key point there. You also need to calculate and test what your network can handle. You need to test what your link can handle, and you need to test what your actual internal hardware can handle. That's a really key point. That you may have a gigabit router, like for instance a 2011 is a gigabit router, but it can't nearly do gigabit firewalling. You know, you have to go up to a CCR standard or an x86 standard machine to try and get gigabit throughput and firewalling and all the various different options you need to mitigate. And identify the weak points in your system and mitigate them. So in other words, when you see that a router is at 70% capacity in normal traffic, you're going to have to upgrade that to be able to deal with you need to have headroom to deal with the attack. So it's a key point there. So purchase hardware and software for management of the situation. And as I like to say, it often gets quoted, buy bigger routers, bitches. It's a really important point. And while it's said in a humorous way, it is actually a serious thing. You do need to have the firepower to deal with these problems, you know. Our favorite routing product will be probably the x86 running on with Mikrotik router OS. Either good quality x86 servers from Intel, Dell, or HP, something like that, with hot lava cards. They're pretty amazing. Like you could get, it won you about 40 gig interfaces for sub $10,000. So I think that's pretty good in terms of value for money, and also you get a fair bit. You get the full capabilities of the Mikrotik router operating system for sub 10K, which I think is a pretty good price as well. So and because the individual performance per core on an x86 system is high, that allows you to deal with denial of service attacks quite well. So managing your denial of service response, you have to create an incident response plan. What am I talking about there? Who's in control of the situation? Like who has the call on whether you can make a change to a router or not? What's an acceptable change control? Like, is there an emergency change approval board? These are questions that you need to know the answers to when you're being attacked, because it could take half an hour to an hour to get people out of bed, and that might be too late for some of your SLAs. So this key point there. You need also contact and escalation lists ready at hand for your ISP, your upstream ISPs, your peers, and key members of your let's say customer staff, like technical staff on your customer side, and just verify the out-of-hours services. In other words, like Cogent, I'd have to be fair to them. They actually have full 24/7 cover, and they will jump on a router. And I've tested this quite well. Like, they actually jump on it. They will make changes 24/7. You're not waiting around on hold to talk to an engineer. While other providers, I have to say, haven't been really at that if they want to make a change or have to add in a route manually, you're generally trying to wake up an on-call engineer to do it. So just watch that and have that. The time to have that conversation with your ISP is now, as opposed to when you're trying to get through and trying to get over the problem. So what's so difficult about denial of service attacks? Well, it's fairly straightforward. The fundamental rule of QoS, and Greg will talk more about this tomorrow, but effectively you can only control traffic that leaves your router. You can't control traffic that hits your router. The problem with the distributed denial of service attack is effectively by the time it's hit your router, there's nothing you can do. There's no quick fix, there's nothing. They've consumed all the bandwidth all the way down to your router, and effectively it's too late. And so what you need to do is start thinking outside the box. You need to start thinking, well, how can I stop this traffic hitting me when it's too late? And the way we do that is we actually talk to our upstream providers. And if you think about it like this, by actually getting our upstream providers to do the work for us, we could actually massively reduce the impact on our network, and in most cases completely eliminate it. So the smart play, what we're trying to do is you identify the victim. So your plan, or the logic behind all this process, is that you're trying to identify the victim of the attack, get their IP address, and then call your ISP. So even if you hadn't all this stuff set up, you can just ring your ISP, your transit provider, and say, look, I need you to black hole this IP urgently. And your provider will do it and use their much bigger hardware, their much bigger routers, their much bigger bandwidth to deal with the problem before it saturates your link. And if there's anything you take from this presentation, that's it. That's what you need to do. So I just prepared a workflow because I think in the previous times I've given this presentation, there was still a bit of confusion. So effectively what you have here is you have a normal operation, so everything's hunky-dory. An attack begins and suddenly you start to see packet loss. So the actions that you will take are all in blue boxes there. And effectively what you'll do is you'll measure, analyze, and identify the victim, which will be the destination of all this malicious traffic. You then contact all your transit providers, all your peer providers, and ask them to be blackholed. If one of your transit providers is not picking up the phone and they're sending you loads of traffic, just stop advertising to them, pull down your session with them, unplug the cable if you speak. But if you have at least 2 transit providers, you'll have that option. So if you have one transit provider that's on the ball and one that's not so on the ball, you can effectively get them to black hole it on the good ISP and just disconnect your bad ISP. So these are the things that you need to have in your head, that your kind of, your playbook, as the fellow would say, that, when you're actually dealing with the attack. So if after doing that, you're still having packet loss, you need now to remeasure. So you think you found the victim, they've black holed it, but you still have a load of traffic hitting your network. You need to relook at it again. Maybe you got the wrong IP, or maybe there's multiple IPs being hit. And you keep repeating that process over and over again until finally you get back to normal traffic levels. Now, the unfortunate thing for your victim, or your customer in this case, or yourself, is effectively what the attacker intended to happen has been fulfilled and has been completed by you actually black holing them. But the reason for that is that you've actually sacrificed the victim so that the rest of your network, the rest of your client base are still active. And that's a key point there. So there's no point, sorry about this, there's no point, should be up here somewhere. Anyway, so basically there's no point in having all your customer base put out by one person being attacked. Take them out, isolate them, and then give them IP addresses to get them back online. So that's the final step. It was actually the second last step. There was one step I hadn't added in there, but you'll have them black holed, and generally most people will black hole for about a month to 6 weeks just to be sure. So often you'd want to just keep that in mind. So obviously a month to 6 weeks later, you would actually undo that black hole to reintroduce that IP to be a useful IP on your network again. So limiting your attack surface is a key point there. So you filter on all your routers, but especially your client base. You limit using the input chain to limit all inbound traffic from your public-facing route on your public-facing interfaces on all your public-facing routers, and disable any service and prevent it from listening on the public interface. So if you're not using a service, disable it. And this is in line with the likes of the NIST or the NSA guidelines for hardening or securing your routers. And in fact, if you're looking for information, both of those and also the US CERT team, they have some fantastic documentation and to give you ideas. Usually it's for the more incumbent vendors, but you can transpose that and apply it to the likes of Mikrotik equipment, which is what we do on our network ourselves. And it gives you plenty of scope for thought, and it actually gives you good technical reasons why you should do the steps that they're suggesting you carry out. So what can Mikrotik do to help? Well, first of all, I'll start off by saying that Mikrotik by default as a CPE will not be vulnerable to denial of service attack. Unfortunately though, if you're like me and most other ISPs, you blow away the Mikrotik default configuration and you put a scripted configuration on, you're running the risk then of making them vulnerable again. And the key thing there is, obviously you want a DNS proxy for your local clients as a client unit. The issue there is you only want to provide it on the local LAN for the provider in the house. So for the people who are in the house, you want to provide DNS proxying for. But you don't want to do it for the internet, and you don't want to help me attack Greg or Yanis's PC at home. So that's the key thing there, and I wouldn't do it to Yanis anyway because he's bigger than me. So, but if in terms of internal, one of the key things that I think Mikrotik could do is introduce interface classifications in the firewall. So you'd have internal versus external, trusted versus untrusted. So almost like you have interface lists in the same way as you have address lists, and perhaps merge the DNS resolver with the DNS server, DHCP server. So only have a DNS resolver when you're actually handing out DHCP addresses on a particular interface, which is obviously a LAN type interface. What ISPs should do to help others is very straightforward. There's this thing called BCP 38, best current practice number 38. It's an incredibly useful rule, but it's not that well known, and I'm repeating myself here again because it is actually an important one to use. And if every ISP did do this particular step, it would eliminate spoofed amplification attacks from the internet effectively. The problem is it's a classic pay it forward scenario. So just to describe what you have to do for best current practice. On all your routers that are facing upstream providers, on the external interface that's facing your external provider, no traffic should be going to your external provider that's from an IP address that's not on your network, your customer's network, or a peer of your network, period. And if you actually, so you should allow all those IPs, your own IPs, your customer IPs, your peer IPs, and every other IP on the internet should be blocked from leaving your network. And this has also a handy thing of avoiding becoming an accidental transit provider as well, that if you did this, you would actually prevent yourself from being an accidental transit provider. However, the problem with this is that it can be very tough to manage on a bigger network. Like if you have thousands of clients, it is pretty tricky. So what can ISPs do? What can you do to protect yourself? Well, a couple of things. You can filter incumbent traffic. So from your external providers, traffic coming to your router from them should never have a source IP that's on your network or on a single homed customer of yours. So all your IPs are on your network. So any traffic will stay within your network. So no one else on the internet should be spoofing packets from your network, and you shouldn't be allowing them to reach any device within your network. So the key thing there is to block your own source IPs from your upstream providers. This should never happen in reality. The other thing is Team Kimru, and I've done numerous presentations on how to actually set up Bogon. I think I did one in 2012 in New Orleans. So I'd suggest you just maybe recap on that, but actually go through how to set up a Bogon feed with Team Kimru, which are a great bunch of lads who do work hard to improve the internet security for everyone. And filter, at the very basic, filter your own, filter private, as they call it, RFC 1918 addresses, all the private ranges, so 10.0.0/8, 192.168.0.0/16, and 172.16.0.0/12. So if you wanted, let's say, if an ISP wants to protect themselves, very straightforward. You want to block inbound attacks to, let's say, your DNS service and stuff like that. You'll see here on the bottom we've got a traffic, and it's basically a forward in interface from Ether 1, which will happen to be a Cogent, I think, IP interface. And Ether 3 was, let's say, my internet exchange interface. And basically what I said there was, if it's from the Wireless Connect address list or address range, all of our customers and all that, drop it. That's what we're saying, so if it's spoofed. Here's another, just a more clear example of the BCP 38. So basically, in this case, what we're saying is, you can see rule number 10 there I've highlighted. We can see here that I'm forwarding traffic going out on Ether 1, which will be going to Cogent. If it's not from my customer IPs or my own, thanks very much for that. Cheers. So if it's not from my customer IPs, drop it. And the same here for another uplink, which is INEX on LAN 1, and another one on INEX on LAN 2. So on all my upstream peers, I'm basically blocking traffic that's not from my own customer ranges. And from my upstream customer or transit providers, I'm blocking traffic that's purporting to be from my own network, which I know is completely false. So this is just an illustration here of how it would work. So you have your border router here and your upstream router. So we have this IP range here, 185.55.204.0/22. And what we're saying is we'll allow traffic out from this router to this router from this range. And then we put a rule below that on the firewall saying drop everything else. And that will allow internet connectivity, no restrictions on anyone's freedom or nothing like that, just completely open and secure internet communication for your customer. So every ISP, as I said, if every ISP did provide or deploy BCP 38, the world would be a lot better place. The problem is it is a pay it forward. In other words, the problem is if a few big ISPs don't implement BCP 38, it ruins it for everyone else, effectively. That's the problem. So it's kind of like vaccination. If you want to actually eradicate it, you have to vaccinate everyone. And that's as simple as that. So, but there are benefits to it. As BCP 38 becomes widely implemented, remote amplification attacks will be less used. And malware botnets will probably change their spoofing tactics to only spoof IPs within your network. So for instance, if JJ there was infected with, and he's a customer of mine, and he wants to attack Greg, what he might do is spoof everyone else's IP on my network and attack Greg, but not his own. In that case, he'd be notable by his absence, but that would be one thing. But in terms of, but it would confine it. But if Greg is looking at the attack traffic coming in, he'll say, I'm getting a lot of attack traffic from this particular network range, and he can ask his upstream provider to filter that. So the key thing is, like what they would probably do as an evolution would be to do a whois lookup of a particular IP that, let's say you infect a particular PC, that PC then runs codes to say, who is my own IP address? Okay, I can spoof all these IPs. So that would be the evolution. But there are actually ways to counter that as well. So spoofing within the AS is still possible, but not beyond it. And responding to that, there is actually a way we can respond to it, and it's through strict unicast reverse path forwarding. And this is a system that was developed in the Linux kernel a while back ago, and effectively it does source validation on traffic, and it's pretty nice that way, and I'm going to go through that in more detail now. So effectively, if I was to manually respond to the problem that I just highlighted there of botnets actually just spoofing IPs within your IP range. Well, what we can actually do is, if you can imagine here, we've got this 185.55.204.0/22. That's the entire network here. But we also have this small network, 185.55.207.0/24. So it's a smaller subnet. So what I can do on this small access router is I can allow traffic from this range only up to this router. Basically, so allow it only from this range and drop everything else. So effectively, if there was an infected host here and it tried to spoof traffic from here, it would get blocked. But the problem with that is it's a bitch to manage. You're constantly updating. As you add in an IP address on a router and as you add a new access subnet, you actually then have to manage that and manage firewall rules and all sorts of things. So it complicates things. However, with unicast reverse path forwarding, you're actually using, the kernel uses its routing table to validate whether the traffic flowing through it makes sense or not. Do you get me? So in here, basically what we do is we say, allow traffic from this, drop all outbound, and we enable unicast reverse path forwarding loose on this router here. The reason for that we use loose, I'll explain in a while. But on an access router here, access router 1, we enable unicast reverse forwarding with strict mode. And if multiple paths exist, you would only use loose. And the reason for that is the strict mode will use the best route available. And if there's an alternate route that's still legitimate or valid, it would drop traffic from that alternate route. And that's the problem there. So if you have multiple paths between a client and your router, you would always have to use loose. But if you have a single path between your client, your best practice is to use strict. If you want to turn on unicast reverse path verification on your Mikrotik router, it's very straightforward. You click on IP settings, and you select your route, your reverse path filter there. It's very straightforward. So URPF, basically just to give you the example, it'll route packet, if it's in strict mode, it'll route forward the packet if a route exists for the packet and is active in the forwarding information base or is an active route in the router. And if it has arrived in the same interface that the router would use to actually send the return traffic, that's the key thing there. And that's where if you have multiple paths to a customer, that's where it would actually block it. So that's the key thing there to be aware of. So if we go with loose, again, we just forward the packet if the route exists. And we'll drop the packet if there's a black hole route for it. And that's the key thing there. That's a really nice feature for us. The other thing just to highlight is that on the core of your network, particularly if you're multi-homing, we would suggest that you use full route tables, even though it uses a lot more RAM. But one of the benefits is that if you remove a default route from your router, and you only have the actual full IP route table of the internet, then any spoof traffic that's in, let's say, the dark areas of the internet that aren't actually legitimate or properly advertised, any of those spoof traffic would be automatically dropped by your routers, which is a nice feature. So that's a key thing to be make there, and that's a lot of providers would call that a default free zone, DFZ. So what are the symptoms? So I'm now going to move, the next part of this presentation, we're actually moving into aspects of how we actually detect a denial of service attack, how it looks actually on real graphs, and how we can kind of identify the victim or of the attack. So in this case here, you'll obviously have massive packet loss. You might think it's a routing issue, but then when you go into your routers, all the routes seem valid. But your links will be fully utilized, probably on the inbound. And you'll have lots of UDP or TCP SYN traffic to one or more addresses on your network. So that's the kind of indicators there. Your links are flatlining, and your provider's graphing systems will show a significant spike in traffic. So for instance, so what we have to do now is try and measure the attack and monitor that. And what's the best way of doing that? Well, it's to monitor inbound interface graphs for sudden spikes either on your router on inbound traffic or from your service provider monitored port, which would be their outbound traffic. So here's an example of one where we were averaging around, I suppose, 250 megabits per second across the board, and we saw a spike there of about 800 megs come in at this point, and then a follow-up which was closer to saturating the entire link. So some people would suggest that this was possibly in a reconnaissance run to just see how much bandwidth they needed to generate a certain level of packet loss, and this probably was the attack itself. So this is just an example there where you actually see, so here you've got a gigabit per second, and then you've got your normal traffic graph here, which is quite cyclical, and then you've got your spikes, which are the attack itself. So if we were to detect the attack, check your inbound interface graphs for sudden spikes, okay, and this is in the packet per second. So you see here, we're probably running around 50 to 60,000 packets per second on average, and we saw a spike of around 95,000 packets per second there, and then right up to about 105,000 packets, 110,000 packets per second here. So now we're actually starting to see, okay, well, this is how I could automate, rather than getting phone calls from my customers telling me that I have massive packet loss. But perhaps if I had something monitoring this graph automatically, and when it reached certain thresholds, that it would alert me that might be a useful way of detecting and denial of service. So in this case here, we've got Open NMS. Lots of the guys like that one. Observium, easy setup, lovely graphs, but it's not hugely customizable. The Dude, which is being developed sometimes. And then you've got NetXMS. Sorry. So NetXMS, Thomas Kernak from Slovakia, from RF Elements, worships this product, and I have to say he introduced it to me, and it's pretty cool. Then you've got the free ones, like some MRTG, which is free, lovely setup, and it's done by Tobias Ecker, some Swiss guy, if I remember correctly, and he's really cool, very open. I've often emailed him questions, and he's actually very open and a nice guy. Then there's a professional version of this, which is a lot easier set up. And basically what you're trying to do now is set up bandwidth alerts. So I'm just giving you ideas of a few tools there that you may want to investigate. NetXMS one is one that's quite popular. Observium is another one. And Open NMS are the ones that come to mind that I think are well worth looking at. MRTG is very good if you're trying to develop your own solution and you want to integrate it with your own management platform. Then MRTG is where it's at. So Cacti Immunin, if you want to get them running, Greg Sowell does a great article on setting up, but I still hate Cacti, I have to say. I just had a bad experience with SNMP version 3. I think it shouldn't be called SNMP version 3. I think it should be called Not Simple Management Protocol version 1. Be more appropriate. But just to talk about attacks and trying to glean information about an attack and what was happening, and to try and work out a signature. If we look here, we got 3 attacks in one day, so we were pretty unlucky on this day for some reason. And what we actually start to see is attack 1 and 2. If we look at attack 1, peaks at around 800 megabits per second. Legitimate link demand was around 300 megs. There was a peak of about 100,000 packets per second, as opposed to 40,000 packets per second on average, you know. Attack 2, kind of similar profile again, around 30,000 packets per second. Was the legitimate use at the time, but 110 was actually generated in the attack. And the peak was, in this case, 992 megabits per second. Now, Attack 3 has a very different profile. Attack 3, you can see here, while it generates not as much as Attack 1, it's pretty high in the actual packets per second. So if we actually analyze this further, what we can actually see is that the average packet size of this first attack, Attack 1, so if I was trying to find where the source or destination, who was attacking me, stuff I need to find out is what protocol, what ports. But unfortunately, with a simple graph like this, there's very little information I can get. But it's like everything, you have to glean as much information from a simple source of information as possible. In this case, the only thing I could really get is, I have the bits per second here, and I have the packets per second here. So I can actually determine roughly what sorts of packets were actually being sent to me in terms of their size. So we can see here 1041, so 1041, basically kilobyte packets were being used to attack me in Attack 1, and about 1.1 kilobytes attack in Attack 2. Now I would actually say that they were both identical attacks, and that's just statistical error on my part. Does everyone understand that? Yep. And you can see it, the same kind of graph, same like capabilities. Attack 3 is very different in the whole reason, for the number of reasons. I will discuss in a few minutes, but the first one is that the amount of packets per second is huge. It's about 410,000 packets per second. So I was being hit with about 162 byte packets in that attack, and they were able to generate with those smaller packets 900 megs. So if we analyze it further, I'll do that, okay. So if we try and measurement, there is a bit of measurement uncertainty. Key aspect of measurement is there's no significant disturbance in the system. The problem with this is we're measured with a graph that says here's what's happening in the system. And so really when I measure the attack, I'm only taking the bit that's above the normal, you see? The problem is that when I do that, there's been a massive shift. All my legitimate traffic has been displaced. So I was being quite optimistic there and say that the attack was only the difference between this amount of bandwidth and let's say here. But in fact, probably all of my traffic was displaced, which would give it another few hundred megabytes. So this is the key thing here, that you can only get rough information from these types of simple graphs. And that's what I wanted to highlight. One of the interesting things I wanted to point out here is that you'll see here that all of our traffic got displaced. But in this attack, you see here, well, actually, no, there was a lot of response traffic here. And what this would lead me to believe is that this was actually a TCP SID attack. So we had a flood of TCP SID requests, and we had whatever requests hit the client that was in the intended target, there was actually SID ACK packets being sent, which actually shows the reason why there's a higher response time here. However, if you look at Attack 3, we see that when the attack came inbound, there was a massive drop in outbound traffic. And that would indicate to me that they were just doing a simple UDP flood just to consume all my bandwidth. And also, by looking at that graph there, I could safely say that they had eliminated all the traffic on my network, or at least 90% of it. Because what I should have had, that graph should have been all green there. But you see that trough? Trough shows that they were actually quite successful. So this is the type of information you can get from a very simple graph that just shows bandwidth. So and what I'm trying to do there was, with the information that I had available, find out as much about the attack as possible and hypothesize where I needed to, what type of attack it was. And this is important for when you start using tools like Torch, you know what type of traffic you're going to be hitting. So removing the uncertainty, well, if you use something like traffic flow in Mikrotik or Cisco NetFlow or SFlow from the open standard one, it's pretty good. This allows you to identify individual flows on your network, and it actually can give you ideas about source and destination, the protocols, the ports, and the flows, the number of connections that are actually going through at one time. And this is an important aspect of, this is why NetFlow was pretty much established, not only for billing, but to allow a person who is actually dealing with denial of service attack a way of actually understanding it more. The only unfortunate thing about NetFlow or traffic flow is it requires effort to set up, and that effort has to be done generally before you get attacked. But it is well worth doing because you do get good information about stats about what's happening on your network, and I'd certainly suggest you use it. So if you want to set up NetFlow, it's very straightforward. Mikrotik, all Mikrotik routers support NetFlow, or traffic flow as Mikrotik call it. Effectively what you do is you go IP, traffic flow, and you select the interfaces that you want. You obviously check the enable box. You can set your caches, that's no problem. Save your resources. So if you've got like 20 interfaces on your device and you have 2 upstream carriers, just select the 2 or the 3 interfaces that you're using. Don't select a load of internal ones. Configure the NetFlow analyzer. Well, you just simply click on targets, add, and you add the IP address of your NetFlow analyzer server or even your laptop, you know, if you're just in the middle of an attack. So this is the key thing there. So you may have a computer that's set up in your office that receives these NetFlows, and you may not monitor it on a daily basis, but in the middle of an attack, what you want to do is fire it up and just get useful statistics. By configuring the target, you tell the router where to send the NetFlow packets, the information about what's happening on the router. So there are a number of different NetFlow analyzer targets that are open source and free. The freest one, if that's a word, the most free one will be NTOP, and that runs on Linux or Windows. If you run it on Linux, the original NTOP version was unrestricted. There's a new version called NTOP NG, and it is a superior product. It's more scalable. And this one actually allows you to kind of do much bigger traffic flows in terms that it's more modular design than the original NTOP. So NTOP is kind of, I suppose, a play on the whole like top, you know, command in Unix where you'd want to find out what's using all your CPU resources. This one here tells you what's using all your network resources. There's also PM accounts. I can't pronounce it, but this one is an open source tool. It's completely customizable. It's difficult enough to set up, but one really nice feature about this, and I was asked about this by a guy, and possibly the guy with the glasses over there, asked me about a year or 2 ago. He asked me, well, how do you get AS information from your NetFlows, because Mikrotik doesn't support it. Well, this would allow you to do it because what you can do is you can combine your NetFlow and your BGP peering sessions with this. So this particular piece of software effectively allows you to manage an iBGP peer, so you get all your information about autonomous system paths, and it also takes NetFlow, so you get information about autonomous systems upstream and all that, sources and destination. It's quite popular amongst top tier ISPs, but I will warn you, there's a bit of effort in trying to get the information you want out of it. But it's there. It gives you all of it. You can dump it all into SQL. There's a few other ones, Flow Tools, Flow Scan, IP Flow, NetFlow Manager. There's a free one from SolarWinds, NetFlow Analyzer, that allows you to analyze stuff for about an hour. So it'll give you an hour's backward view of what was happening on your network. So just type of information that would be useful in terms of NetFlow in a denial of service. Well, the top hosts in the last 5 minutes will be a pretty good one. What host has been receiving the most amount of traffic in the last 5 minutes, and versus top host in the past hour. So that'll probably, the guy at the top of that list is your victim. Simple as that. And very nice, simple graph. And it's very straightforward to find that. You can also find information about the application and protocol. This can be used in more kind of intricate denial of service, where you're trying to actually go, okay, I'm going to start filtering these types of packets that match this profile. Like, so you could filter based on, is it UDP or is it TCP SYN? Has it a certain packet size? Is it going a certain direction to a certain victim? So NetFlow tips. Keep the NetFlow target as close as possible to your core routers. there's no point in sharing the same interface that your normal traffic has to flow on, because NetFlow will not be much use to you if it's down during the denial of service attack. So you have to keep that traffic out of band. Does everyone get what I'm saying there, yeah? It's really important, that point. There's also denial of service specific NetFlow targets. Arbor Networks, very good. You want to have deep pockets though. But I haven't said that if you are running like a huge environment, the ROI is there, definitely. For smaller ISPs, like my humble self, it's just not an affordable solution at the moment. IBM Aurora is another one that actually has, but again, that can be quite an expensive solution as well. But these are the kind of, as in, if you were doing consulting with a larger ISP or provider, these are the type of products that they say, look, we need something yesterday that can automatically, like Arbor Networks is pretty good, that it'll actually automatically detect an attack and then actually start mitigating it actively by using black holes or rerouting traffic to scrubbers. That's for my next presentation, I think, that one. In the event that you're like me, when I got my first hit of a denial of service attack, and I hadn't set up NetFlow, it's not the end of the world. That's the key thing there. That's why Torch exists, and Torch is, so don't go try to build a whole monitoring infrastructure where your whole network's fallen asunder. There's no point. Torch will give you the information you need, you just need to know how to read it, okay? Basically what you want to do, the way I like to call Torch, is it allows you to shine a light in a very dark space, and it allows you to kind of see what's going on. So in this case, it's the kind of way I'd say, the way I describe Torch versus NetFlow is, Torch is like when you're out camping, and NetFlow is more like a floodlight system in your national stadium, so it kind of gives you a lot more information. The key thing is, like if you go to Tools and Torch, select your outbound interface, look at the destination traffic, and organize it by destination. So if you're a simple one, that mightn't tell you, you're looking for, let's say, a particular attack rate. So here you can see there was 100 megs going and a few, so this was not really this wasn't really a distributed denial of service attack. It was more like kind of a very focused, like there was a couple of hosts with a lot of bandwidth attacking a particular host here. So the key thing there, or a number of hosts here, the key thing there is to look at that. What you'll see in another denial of service attack is that you might see hundreds of just tiny connections, 200K, 500K, hundreds of them going to the same destination. And that's what you have to do, is just scroll up and down the thing and try and see a pattern. That's my tip for you. And it's actually easier than you think, believe it or not. So the key thing is you want your destination address, your protocol port. You can start looking at that in more serious terms, but they're the key things there. So what if I'm attacked? Simple. Implement the plan that I was just talking about there. Try to identify the target of the attack. Work with all interested parties. So the victim could be an ordinary customer. The peers, your upstream ISPs, they're key members of it. If one of those people are not, if one of your peers is not available for whatever reason, simple. Just turn them off if they're sending you loads of traffic. Just turn them off. If you have a redundant path out, that's your play. Use Torch or NetFlow to identify the servers or services that are being targeted. Is it a single IP or is it an entire subnet? The victim profiles typically are gamers, trolls. Did I mention gamers? And then you've got on the more serious, but they're usually the small, spiky, annoying ones that just happen for about 5 to 10 minutes. What happens, I believe, is that a gamer might insult another gamer online, and then the other person hires a botnet for 5 minutes to take out the other person. Not to be encouraged or recommended. And then trolls, people who just like to slag off people on the internet, say nasty things that you wouldn't say in a bar to someone bigger than you. So that's the other side of it. But the other ones here, the bottom ones are less common, but they're by far the most serious. Like if someone has a dispute with a government and they're willing to do a denial of service attack, they're in it for the long haul. And if it's a commercial organization, it could be lots of money at stake. And by taking out a competitor's business, that you'll actually win their business. It's a pretty nasty way to do with business. It's a completely terrible way to do it, but some people have done it. and it'd be quite successful to do that, unfortunately. Working with the victim of attack, you have to let them know, inform them that they're under attack, and that you're working to mitigate the attack. And you try to get them back up as soon as possible. But the first thing you need to do is turn off the traffic going to your victim. The second thing is to get your victim back online. And present that in a nicer way to your client. I'm being honest with yourselves, but for the guy who's been hit, no one likes to be told that they're being taken off the air because, you know, they're bringing down the rest of your network. Prepare them to migrate them to a new IP range. That's the standard operating procedure. Get them to move their DNS with really short TTLs, because the problem is the attack will follow them. You know, when they, you know, if an attacker sees that their website's back up, they'll go, oh, okay, let's do an edit DNS lookup. They moved IP, and they'll hit the new IP. So you want to have a short TTL just to keep moving it. And so the whole way you're actually dealing with the attack is through evasion, not confrontation. You can't beat this. So the way you do it is you just step around it and get someone else who's bigger than you to actually deal with the traffic. That's exactly what this whole presentation is about. It's evasion, and get bigger guys to deal with the problem for you. Your upstream providers, let them know. If you don't have your BGP session set up with them, call them. They usually are more than happy to black hole traffic, because that traffic's costing them money and filling their pipes as well. And they have better equipment to deal with it, because they're dealing with a much larger scale usually than yourself. So I go to briefly, because I'm on about an hour, but I think there's 15 minutes given to me by my esteemed colleague who finished 15 minutes earlier. So do you want me to continue, or do you want me to wrap up? Keep going? That's great. Yes. Okay, I'm not boring you. That's good. Okay, the one thing I would say is, for the people who haven't been at my previous presentations, what is black hole routing? Black hole routing is effectively filtering traffic with your routing table, and you're not using your firewall filter. And so if we look here, with your normal firewall forward chain filtering, like block traffic going to victim, this IP address, they go through about 3 processes: your pre-routing firewall filter, or firewalling in Mangle, your routing decision, where's the traffic going to, and then your forward. With the black hole routes, what we do is we say, let's just skip here. Why can't we, if we know that it's a bad traffic here, why can't we just black hole it here? And that's exactly what we do. So it's efficient in terms that you're actually dropping traffic earlier on in the packet processing phase of the router. And by doing that, you're actually reducing the load on your router. And reducing the load on a router that's experiencing a denial of service attack is a very good thing. So checking and dropping in the routing process as opposed to routing process plus the forward filter process. And when you're running close to the CPU capacity of the router, that's obviously very good. How to do it? Very straightforward. If you go into IP routes on a Mikrotik router, you're normally adding a Unicast route. Very straightforward. Everyone does it. Their first router you set up, you'd have to set up a default route. And that was effectively a Unicast route. But if you want to add a black hole route, you simply change it from type Unicast to black hole. And there we go. It's going to vaporize or discard the packet once it comes into the router. So once you've done this, the traffic levels will be reduced across your network. And this is where, if you combine that setup with a black hole route server on your network, you can automate black holing IPs across your network. Like, so this can be used not just for denial of service, but multiple threats, like for instance, SSH bots, all these type of things that are trying to just hack routers, or multiple different types of threats, spammers. All these, you could actually use black hole routes to actually deal with that throughout your network. And effectively, by implementing it and advertising it on your black hole route server, and having it would actually push out those BGP updates to all your routers on your organization. But in terms of where this really gets cool is in terms of a fast response for a distributed denial of service attack with your upstream providers. So there is a way of doing it faster rather than rigging someone up and saying black hole this victim IP because we're getting hammered. And in this case, what we do is we need to, just to remind you, we need to black hole the traffic before it hits our router. So we have to black hole it in our provider. So if we agree with our upstream provider to set up a BGP peering session between their black hole route server and our black hole route server, I can effectively, by getting this set up, and what we would agree and they would configure their router to do, is that if they learn any routes on this router from my network, that they would automatically black hole it and kill the traffic across their own network. And that's how they would kill the traffic. And what's beautiful about that is as soon as I can identify the victim, I just simply run this command. So in this case, the victim of the attack is 5.134.90.123. And I'm basically saying, advertise that. And it'll advertise it here. This router learns it and pushes it out to all the routers within this AS. And effectively the attack traffic subsides. So I've done a little very cheap animation. It's so bad that you'll definitely know I didn't copy it from anyone on the internet. So here's a kind of small model of the internet, cogent, and there's a few people missing, of course, but just rough bandwidth sizes, okay? So then we've got the zombie armies. They're there. I see a lot of you preparing with AR-15s for the day that the zombies attack, but these are the computer zombie types. The AR-15s don't work so well with them. But so then what you have here is you got so you obviously annoy someone, and they pay these guys who control these zombie armies to generate loads of traffic towards your network. And it comes and it saturates your pipes. Simple as that. And effectively, we would then send our remote trigger black hole up, saying please block the victim's IP. And suddenly that traffic would subside, that traffic would subside. And then depending on the peering relationships between the ISPs upstream, they would kill it off further and further. And the attack would be gone. So lads, thanks for your attention. We have about 8 minutes for questions. And I really appreciate your attention and hope you enjoyed the presentation. Any questions? I don't bite. Okay, Justin. Being honest, I didn't have time to look at the CPU. I was looking at the because I was running an x86 box. The CPU wasn't actually affected as much because I was actually able to handle it. The bandwidth was near saturation anyway, so it was actually the bandwidth attacking. It was the bandwidth saturation was my problem in that case. So that was, but you know, I would say it made the routers uncomfortable, definitely. But the main problem was bandwidth in that case. Any other question, guys? Yeah, okay.
My turn.
Nice.
Hey, I run a routed NATed network, so pretty much most of my customers have a single interface, you know, IP that they see. So is any of that going to work for BGP for me to upload? Cause I'm just uploading my external interface then, aren't I? So, it's the black hole, I mean.
If you have a single NAT, okay, if let's say you had, 100 NATed IPs, and one of those NATed IPs got hit, then that would affect 100 customers. Right. You would still black hole it because all your other 100 NAT IPs and all those customers behind them are now being affected by the saturation on your link. Okay. So the key thing there for you is that you'd have a couple, maybe 10 or 20 addresses on standby. You'd disable that IP, you black hole it with your upstream peer, and you'd re-NAT those customers to a new IP range, and then they're back up and running. Is that okay?
That makes sense.
Okay. Awesome. Okay, I think it's Justin Wilson, the legend.
Peering with AS112 servers and things like that. What are your thoughts?
A lot of people think it's very good. Now, it's either because my network is running really well. I think it's the AS112 service was to reduce load on the root servers, the actual DNS root servers, if I remember correctly, from badly configured clients. So basically what the AS112 service is to resolve reverse DNS lookups for 10 you know, like 10.0.0/8, 192.168.0.0/16, and 172.16.00/12. Sorry for that. So basically, in that case, but at our network, we're peered at IDEX, and IDEX have an AS112 service. And in our case, we have 0 packets ever hitting them. So it's a useful service, but for some reason in our network, we're not actually quite using it. But I do think every internet exchange should have it for maybe less properly configured networks. Sorry. Yep. How are you?
My name is Thomas.
How are you doing, Thomas?
I want to add something to. I really liked it, and we are already facing these problems for years as a company. Some scripts based on PM account that can make like in less than 10 seconds, like around 5 seconds, addition to black hole specific destinations.
Awesome.
Through Mikrotik. If somebody wants to have the software, it's for free, so I will bring it open source.
Yeah, it's no, PM accounts is very good, and those scripts, I'd love to have a look at them, being honest, something I'm interested in, so maybe we could hook up. I'll buy you a couple of pints at the bar, but definitely nice to meet you, Tom, and yeah, PM account is pretty good. It's so powerful, and being able to combine net flows and combine it with BGP. So obviously, so what do you use to push the BGP? Sorry, could you give me the mic? What do you use, Tom, to actually push the BGP updates to your black hole root servers, or do you just script it manually?
We use Exa BGP to put it in our routers, and then it will redirect it automatically to the Mikrotiks to filter it. Or if it's, I'm working on it, if it's getting too much traffic, that it automatically send the black hole community to the upstream providers. All right,
cool. So you're using, let's say, an SSH script up to, let's say, your black hole root server from the PM accountant server to advertise the routes, yeah?
He listens like through NetFlow from the upstreams, and he looks every 5 until 10 seconds sampling rates, and then he makes a decision on about how many traffic to this specific host is going to a specific host, and you can change that filters, and then it makes a decision to inject the BGP.
And when you inject the BGP, are you doing it like with an SSH script to the black hole root server, or have you a BGP client that's pushing it up to the root server?
It's like BGP client, like a routing reflector.
Okay, cool, awesome. Thank you very much for that.
Thanks. Excuse me, just another question, Tom. For example, if I have in a company an ISP, maybe a small one, and I can ping local IP addresses, then I am less protected against those services. About it could be. What I want to say is, if I can ping local addresses from the internet, from the IP, the public IP address I was given, then I should call the ISP to get that fixed. Because it could be more vulnerable to the OS.
Yeah, so looks like they're not implementing BCP 38. So basically, what's happened is you have a default route, the ISP has a default route, right? So he's pinging like something like 10.0.0.10 for argument's sake. And it goes through various different hops, and they're all default routes, and then eventually one responds, and that's what he's getting, a ping response. Should never happen because a 10 address should not be on the internet by definition. But yeah, like it's more common than you think, and it's one of the reasons why reflected amplifications are actually possible. So I'd say they might ignore you because you're a user, but if you're peering with them, they'll probably take it more seriously. Thank you very much. Good question. Anyone else? I'm here till Sunday anyway. But no, I'll definitely look, lads. If you have any questions or any queries got Justin Miller, who called me a one-trick pony, which I'm not letting go. Still sore about that, Justin.
Going back to his previous question, you also, as an ISP, have a responsibility not to allow RFC 1918 traffic to go to your peer yourself, your transit provider.
Absolutely. So like on the Internet Exchange, and in fact when I joined the INEX in Ireland, I have to say I learned an awful lot more about routing and routing security by virtue that the guys who were operating it, a guy called Nick Hillard and Barry O'Donovan, and those guys were actually quite, when we were peering with them, they were saying, don't do this, make sure you're not doing that. And it's that type of checklist that I just wish every ISP, but the problem is ISPs just want your money, while an Internet Exchange locally, and that's what's great thing about what Justin Miller and with Justin Wilson and Mike Hammett, by building an Internet Exchange locally, you're actually generating a lot of local knowledge, in your own communities, and it's actually for the betterment of the communities that you do that. And so you'll see the standards of implementation go up by joining an INEX or an IXP, but also you actually have a lower latency. So I really encourage you, if you're friendly with a group of ISPs in your area, you should look at doing it. And certainly in terms of in the US market, OpenIX is where it's at in terms of that type of standard you want to be trying to achieve. But you'll find that latency is low, and you'll get people like Google, Akai, Netflix saying, hey, how can we join, how can we connect? And that saves all of your members money when you do that. So definitely, and I have to say the IDEX community in Ireland is I'm delighted to be a member, and I'm a very small member of it, but I've learned an awful lot when I was there from those guys, yeah, absolutely. And you will find that your standard of implementation, by obeying those standards, the standards are there for a reason, and that's the thing, and it's only when you're being attacked that you kind of learn it the hard way, so I'm hoping that you never have to use this, but if you do, that at least it gives you a playbook to work off. And these will be available on mikrotik.com in a week or two's time. How you doing?
One other thing that is not necessarily BGP, but can really help your network out is if you, on your network that you're supplying to your customers, implement a bridge filter there and only allow your IPs through the bridge filter. And that also saves you if some guy misconfigures his little home router and plugs in the LAN port into the internet port and all that stuff, because all those IPs just go away.
Oh, very good, yeah. So like, if you're running it on that, and you, let's say, presented Ethernet to the client, absolutely a bridge filter will be important to have, or an ACL list on a switched setup. I think I might be running a little bit over time, but we'll definitely chat later. But seriously, guys, if you have any questions, hit me up. I definitely want to see Thomas's PM account scripts. Definitely interested in that. Thanks all for your attention. I really appreciate it.